Sometimes James didn't know when to stop talking. This was one of those times. He'd had a good run with the express while Gordon was away for an overhaul, before helping an engine from the other railway with a passenger train, after that engine's brakes had locked before returning home. The others had indulged James all evening, including the drivers and firemen, but they were now rather bored. "Oh, you should have seen the look on this other engine's face," James bragged. "Seething through gnarled teeth he was, but then I guess anyone would be at the sight of such an attractive locomotive like me. Blazing through with me brass intact." "James," Henry interrupted simply, "stop talking." James's face fell. He glanced round to see that everyone else was tired. "Oh," he said, after an uncomfortable pause. "Was I keeping you up?" He chuckled a moment later, looking at Henry. "I must rest," Henry yawned. "I'm supposed to be out with the kipper this evening, and it's not going to pull itself now, is it?" "No," said James cheekily. "Because who else is going to take the fall for its next accident, eh?" Henry said no more. He huffed loudly and closed his eyes. James wanted to carry on talking about the day's events, but a subtle glare from Donald and Douglas silenced him at once. James couldn't recall exactly when he fell asleep, but the next morning gently woke him from his slumber, with the warmth of his fire spreading through his boiler. He suddenly realised, however, that none of the others had woken up yet, all except Henry, who had left before to take the flying kipper. "Oh, what's with the early start?" he yawned. "There's a heavy goods train that needs taking to the mainland today," explained the firelighter. "The Scottish twins can't go because they're helping out on the branch lines, and Poco's filling in on express duties till Gordon gets back." "Bother," said James hoarsely, but quickly glanced round to make sure he hadn't woken the others. Fortunately, they were still asleep. The driver and fireman arrived a few minutes later, and James complained anxiously to them about starting early just to take some goods. "Nothing we can do about it," they told him. "Flight controller's orders. Sorry, old boy." And so, climbing into the cab, James's crew got themselves ready and set off for the day's work. Now, James didn't like pulling trucks, owing a great deal of said dislike to prior experience, but heavy goods trains were worst of all. The trucks in these were restless, unwieldy, and troublesome. Every wise engine knows, of course, that it's not wise to tell tall tales about your work, but working with trucks usually brought out the worst in James, which is exactly what happened when he had an idea. "Aha!" he said brightly as they entered the yard close to the big station. "I forgot to mention." His driver didn't know what to say, so James went on regardless as he was coupled up. "Firelighter said that this is a stopping goods, so we'll have to drop a handful of trucks off, a bit at a time, over different stations." The driver and fireman exchanged befuddled looks, but accepted what their engine had told them anyway. They were foolish to do so. Some time later, Thomas made his way up the branch line with Annie and Clarabel. They made good time as they reached the junction, even though a special coach had been added to the train for passengers who were joining the express later on. When they arrived, Thomas had to push the special coach to one of the other platforms. He was rather confused when he saw a short line of trucks waiting in place of where the coach should be. "Why are you all here?" asked Thomas. "Boco's supposed to be picking up this coach soon, and I need you out of the way." The trucks were confused too.
"We're only here because we're supposed to be,"
said one of them. James is taking us slow goods today, and there weren't nowhere else for us to go. Thomas frowned uncertainly. Somewhere down the main line, James was speeding through the countryside like a dog on a leash. The driver found him hard to handle. "Steady, James," he called. "I thought you didn't like this sort of work." "Not when it goes by this quickly," chuckled James under his breath. Before too long, they arrived at Edward Station, where James parked some of his trucks on a siding just shy of the yard. And when James felt sure that nobody was watching him, he scurried back to the waiting train, what was left of it anyway, and set off once more. But he'd reckoned without the yard foreman. After stopping briefly at the workstation to fill up on water, James, unperturbed by his actions that day, steamed away to Vickerstown without stopping. Vickerstown is the last point of call on the island of Sodor. The big station here is the last stop before the Fat Controller's Railway crosses over to the mainland, and is always bustling with activity. James was none the wiser as he swanned into the yard. His paint clean, his brass had been polished, and, much to everyone's surprise, he was 20 minutes ahead of schedule. After the shunter had allocated a siding for the now relatively minor number of trucks to be moved to, James set about his work shunting. But no one had realised that a set of points had been left diverted onto the end of the siding, and that Henry was hurtling into the yard as fast as he could with a heavy load of trucks. Whistling frantically, Henry caught James unawares. The crash came all too suddenly. James's guard had jumped clear just in time. But poor Henry now had his front end entangled with the brake van that stood in his path. He felt sore and gravely disappointed. "Henry?" asked James in surprise. "What are you doing here?" "I was meant to be resting after the kipper," Henry groused. "But instead I've had to hurry up and down the line with these trucks, so pardon me for trying to keep time. I'm surprised you didn't notice me while you dawdled at the workstation." "But why?" James replied after a moment's thought. "Were you in such a hurry with this lot anyway?" "I think we both know the answer to that, James," said a familiar voice. Both engines looked up to see the Fat Controller now stood before them. James was embarrassed. "You'll just be glad that Henry was on hand to clear up your mess, James," scolded the Fat Controller. "First I hear reports that an AWOL line of trucks is taking up space reserved for Thomas's special coach, and then the foreman at Wellsworth informs me that you're leaving trucks afoot adjacent to where the China clay is normally shunted, which Henry here has had to pick up, effectively doing most of the job for you. Your performance today reflects very badly on myself, this railway, and, most of all, you." The Fat Controller ordered that James be confined to the shed until he knew how best to stop shirking, and he abrasively strode away. Edward soon arrived with the breakdown train to help clear the mess. He didn't say anything, but gave James a small grin as the red engine slunk back to Tidmouth. The others returned to the shed much later. Henry told Boko, Donald, Douglas and Thomas in vivid detail all about the incident, referring only to an engine who didn't quite know how to take responsibility for his next accident. "But then," finished Henry, "I guess anyone wouldn't be entirely sure of how, especially if they were such an attractive locomotive, blazing through with their brass intact. Hey, James." James said nothing. He had a great deal to think about.